New developments in the 38 Studios scandal.
Alleging fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy.
The biggest piece, of course, has always been Copernicus.
With taxpayers facing a $90 million bill for the 38 Studios disaster.
Another secret meeting with 38 Studios officials.
Curt Schilling concealed financial information.
Curt Schilling denies any wrongdoing.
The situation with 38 Studios is clearly dire enough that the governor is now involved.
This document, and it raises serious questions.
You asked about in that interview a statement.
What I remember just about the event.
Accusing Schilling of slander.
State official is finally launching an investigation.
When I say, what do you want me to apologize for, I'm seriously asking in the sense that I didn't plan on, and I never did anything malicious or illegal.
The story of Project Copernicus is that of so much more than just a game. On the surface, you had one of the most exciting upcoming MMORPGs, a AAA title written by a 22-time New York Times bestselling author, with art created by a renowned comic book creator known for The Amazing Spider-Man, and an entire team of all-stars from across the video game industry, with experience in World of Warcraft, EverQuest, The Elder Scrolls, and more. All brought together by the vision, financial backing, and persuasion of a charismatic, video game obsessed, 3-time World Series championship pitcher whose fame immediately provided him a seat at almost any table. But when you dig a bit deeper, the story goes far beyond the game. A game which never met the light of day, despite being reported by some to be nearly 90% complete. The story is about capitalism, corrupt politics, one man's ego, and an 86-year curse, all of which not only completely destroyed the potential of a great game, but also dramatically impacted the lives of more than 400 employees.
Are you getting paid?
I can't comment.
And in the end, we're left with footage from what looks to be a beautifully created world, with stylistic graphics and a rich history that truly may have competed with the likes of World of Warcraft. But we're also left with millions of dollars of unpaid debts, an investigation by the FBI and the SEC, and the remnants of a state-funded game. This is the story of Project Copernicus. Our story starts here, in 1919 at Boston's Fenway Park. The Red Sox, led by Babe Ruth, also known as Bambino, are coming off a World Series win the year before, giving Boston its 3rd championship in the last 4 years. Ruth, who was already considered one of the best pitchers at the time, started to evolve his game, now playing the field and taking at-bats. And the results were astounding, as he broke the single-season home run record that year. After this amazing season, Harry Frazee, then the owner of the Red Sox, inexplicitly sold Ruth to the New York Yankees, a move that would forever change the face of both franchises. The New York Yankees would go on to win countless titles, many with Ruth, who established himself as one of the greatest players in the history of the game, whose legend is still talked about to this day. And the Boston Red Sox suffered an 86-year championship drought, with many late-game collapses, often to the New York Yankees.
Roller up along first, behind the bag, gets through Buckner.
With this tremendous turn of fortune for both franchises following the trade of Babe Ruth, superstitious fans found the only plausible answer: a curse. And more specifically, the curse of the Bambino. Fast forward 85 years and the 2003 Boston Red Sox had just returned to the playoffs after 3 years of missing out. The team led the major leagues in nearly all offensive categories and was in position to finally lift the curse. Ultimately, however, they ran into the New York Yankees in the American League Championship.
The 11th, tied 5-5. Tim Wakefield back into Aaron Boone.
First at bat of the game. There's a fly ball deep to left. It's on its way. There it goes. And the Yankees are going to the World Series.
The team regrouped in the offseason and added a number of acquisitions to strengthen the team, one of which was Curt Schilling. At the time, a 5-time All-Star pitcher who had won the World Series just a few years before. With their new acquisitions, the Red Sox returned to the playoffs the following year and once again faced off against the Yankees in the American League Championship. This time, however, after losing the first 3 games and trailing in the 9th inning of Game 4, the Red Sox became the first team in Major League history to come back from a 3-game postseason deficit, defeating the New York Yankees in 7 games. They would then go on to face the St. Louis Cardinals in the World Series, where, after 86 years, the Boston Red Sox finally prevailed, ending one of the longest championship droughts in U.S. history, and perhaps most importantly, ending the curse of the Bambino. Now, why am I telling you all of this in a story about an MMO? Well, while one curse ended, another was just beginning. Curt Schilling, the pitcher the Boston Red Sox picked up the season they ended the curse of the Bambino, would stick around Boston for a few more years and even bring another championship to the city before retiring in 2007. Ultimately, Curt, who has since become a bit of a controversial figure, finished his career regarded as one of the better pitchers of his generation. A household name, specifically in Boston, who likely should be in the Hall of Fame if not for his off-the-field antics. In between pitching, however, Curt had a hobby that few in baseball could relate to: gaming. Curt loved video games, and more specifically MMOs, as he was known to play both EverQuest and World of Warcraft. As he neared retirement from baseball, he started looking ahead, and in 2006 created his own video game development studio, Green Monster Games, later to be known as 38 Studios. Curt wanted to revolutionize the gaming industry, and specifically MMOs. He funneled $50 million of his own money into the company, and immediately set out to build an MMO, Project Copernicus. Through his fame and success as an athlete, Curt had access to people that most startup video game companies didn't. And through these connections, he was able to bring in an all-star team from the industry, including artist Todd McFarlane, known for his work in The Amazing Spider-Man and Spawn, writer R.A. Salvatore, a 22-time New York Times bestselling author, as well as designers from EverQuest, The Elder Scrolls, and World of Warcraft. The team was quite possibly the best put together at the time, resembling a little bit the 2004 Red Sox, who similarly brought in some of the best talent from around the league to make their team better. After a few years, the company had grown to more than 400 employees, and while information at this time was scarce, Project Copernicus would progress. Salvatore had created 10,000 years of backstory and history, and was working with McFarlane to align on the art design. In all, the team had created a 4-year story arc, which focused on the world's races, gifted with immortality through a device called the Well of Souls, banding together to defeat a great evil. In 2009, 38 Studios started to experience some difficulties. Previously being funded through Curt's personal finances, the team was having trouble getting new investors. When launching the company, Curt had been adamant about a 50-50 profit share with employees, citing the industry's often bad treatment of developers. In retrospect, this is somewhat comical, with what 38 Studios employees will ultimately face, but at the time it was scaring potential investors, who didn't want to invest with such a small return for themselves. Combine that with the fact that the MMO space was seen as a huge risk at the time, and the company was led by a man who had virtually no experience leading a video game company, and was often seen as completely oblivious and narrow-minded when discussing business, investors weren't interested. 38 Studios, however, did continue with financing from Curt and a few small loans, and in 2009 the company acquired Big Huge Games. At that time, Big Huge Games had released the Rise of Nation games, but Curt and 38 Studios were more interested in a prototype action-adventure game, which had been in development for some time. Needing money, 38 Studios would aim to take this prototype, attach some of the world that they had been working on for Project Copernicus, and release it, hoping in the process to continue funding the studio as well as introduce gamers to the world of Amalur. In 2010, while still working on both of its games, 38 Studios would finally get an investor. Taxpayers. Outgoing Rhode Island Governor Don Cherry, with only months left in his tenure, pitched a $75 million loan from the Rhode Island Economic Development Center to bring the studio, along with its more than 400 employees, from Massachusetts to Providence, Rhode Island. Now, this agreement is covered in corrupt politics. According to Curt, he was working with a few lawmakers in Rhode Island on the deal. But when he first went to the State House to discuss the loan, he had to go in through the back door. And during the debate, he found out that a majority of the lawmakers didn't even know about the plan to deliver $75 million, more than half of the total fund, to 38 Studios. The agreement, however, was approved by state legislation, and in 2010, the studio packed up and moved to Providence, Rhode Island. In 2011, 38 Studios released its first game, Kingdoms of Amalur, the completed version of the prototype they received when acquiring Big Huge Games in 2009. The game, which takes place in the same universe as Project Copernicus, was tasked with introducing players to the world of Amalur, somewhat of a prequel to Project Copernicus. And the game was met with some success, receiving favorable reviews and even promising sales. But while on the outside this looked to have been the start of the payoff of more than 6 years and $133 million spent on building 38 Studios and Project Copernicus, on the inside, the company was falling apart. Financially, the company was bleeding money even with the loan from Rhode Island. It was reported that they were spending $4 to $5 million a month. From a development standpoint, the 38 Studios team couldn't come up with a unified vision, had serious issues with management, and were consistently trying to do more than what was possible. Much of the issues seem to have stemmed from Curt himself, with many employees reporting that he would make requests that were often contrary to the direction of the game and of the direction of the game's directors. And when questioned, Curt would get aggravated with employees, and he had been quoted as saying, "As chairman and founder, who's above me?" He was even reported to have downright ignored employees who wouldn't do what he said. This attitude, however, wasn't all too uncommon for Curt. During his baseball career, he was known for a bravado on the mound and was often criticized for running his mouth and getting in conflicts with management, other players, and the media. During the 1993 World Series, Schilling would be found in the dugout with a towel over his head whenever his teammate Mitch Williams was on the mound. Later in his career, he damaged a camera with a bat due to a call he disagreed with. And he even wrote a blog post blasting a former teammate about his conduct around the team. In 2007, he criticized several baseball reporters, calling them people with so little skill in their profession that they need to speculate, make up, fabricate, to write something interesting enough to be printed, and later calling them bad people. Throughout his career, he would often call out coaches and players before taking responsibility himself. As an ESPN reporter once said, "During the past few days, the country has discovered Schilling's little secret, the one baseball insiders have known for years, but has rarely surfaced into the mainstream. Someone more intent on polishing his personal image through whatever means possible." Throughout his career, he has been a controversial figure, and much of that has continued beyond his retirement as well. He hosted a podcast on the far-right website Breitbart, has publicly tweeted showing support for lynching journalists, the January 6th US Capitol riots, and compared Muslims to Nazis. Schilling is a man who is carried by his own pride and flawed ego. His antics have gotten him in trouble throughout his career, even eliminating him from the opportunity to be placed in the Baseball Hall of Fame and later fired from ESPN. And it's this same ego that made him ignore all the signs around him when his studio was falling apart. Curt sincerely believed that Copernicus was the best thing since sliced bread. Schilling could not imagine a scenario where other people would not see the same potential he did. Many years later, when asked about the dire position 38 Studios was in, Schilling said, "We never had the sense of urgency or panic. I think there was a sense of invulnerability." And then in May of 2012, 2 years after coming to an agreement with the state of Rhode Island, 38 Studios missed its first $1.13 million payment to the state. In a public response, the company announced that it would make the payment, but first it would need to fire all of its temporary employees and its contractors, as well as miss payroll for its current employees. So the following day, 38 Studios hand-delivered the check, opting to pay off its loan instead of its employees, except the check bounced, with the CFO at the time confirming that there was not enough to cover what was owed. And at the time, more news started coming out of the company beyond just missed loan payments. 38 Studios had been neglecting numerous expenses for months. In a letter published by a spouse of an employee at 38 Studios, she talked about getting collection letters from a moving company demanding payment for their work bringing the family to Rhode Island, a fee that 38 Studios said they would cover for employees. In addition, the company promised to take over employees' mortgages on their houses in the Boston area and sell them for employees. And of course, some of those houses weren't sold, and 38 Studios just stopped making mortgage payments, leaving these employees with 2 mortgages to worry about. The company also wasn't paying premiums on its employees' insurance program. And in that same letter, she discussed how a pregnant employee had gone in for a checkup and was told that she couldn't come back because her insurance coverage was ending in 2 days. And another employee's wife couldn't receive a bone marrow transplant because they lacked insurance, something that they thought they had. 38 Studios was in way over its head financially. Project Copernicus, however, had been progressing, and during the time the company continued to put out teasers and content exploring the world. And as we can see, it looked pretty good. Schilling himself continued to reach out to anyone he could to find an investor to save the company. Whether or not he came close is up for debate, but according to Schilling, he reached 2 close agreements, both of which fell through due to external factors. Ultimately,
we begin tonight with in-depth coverage of the 38 Studios scandal. The video game developer is finished.
38 Studios formally declared bankruptcy in June of 2012. Stating that it owed $150 million to more than 1,000 creditors, including $115.9 million owed to the state of Rhode Island. With the announcement, the FBI and the SEC opened an investigation into 38 Studios. Although the timing was said to be a coincidence, and ultimately no wrongdoing was found. The state of Rhode Island sued Curt Schilling, alleging fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy, of which Schilling had to pay at least $2.5 million to settle, and ultimately left him broke. Unable to pay its debts, Rhode Island taxpayers have been on the hook for 38 Studios' loan, with payments that continued through 2020. The nearly 400 employees that didn't receive their final payment did eventually receive them, but these also came nearly a decade later, and sometimes they were only 14% of what they were owed. The studio auctioned off all of its assets, including office furniture and memorabilia, although there were no takers for either of the company's IPs, until nearly 6 years later, in 2018, THQ Nordic acquired the IP rights to Kingdoms of Amalur, including all of the assets of the nearly completed Project Copernicus for $900,000. Since then, the company has released a remastered version of the game titled Re-Reckoning in 2020, which saw mixed reviews, as well as a release of an expansion title called Fatesworn in 2021. The company has not, however, commented about the assets of Project Copernicus. Realistically, all these assets are more than a decade old by now, and it would probably be easier to start fresh on a new MMO than bring Project Copernicus into the world today. But that hasn't stopped many MMO enthusiasts from hoping that THQ Nordic does something with these assets. Honestly, even by today's standards, the game looks good, and much of the world, story, and even the races and classes have already been created. So who's to say that some version of this world couldn't exist and thrive today? So what ultimately caused the cancellation of Project Copernicus? The answer is simple: a curse. Curt did do the impossible when he ended the 86-year curse of the Bambino, except that he didn't. Instead, the curse followed him to his next endeavor, intoxicating the potential of 38 Studios and Project Copernicus. But it didn't stop there. The curse has continued throughout the MMO industry, causing cancellations, shutdowns, and just flat out bad games. So while Curt Schilling ended the curse of the Bambino, he brought a new curse to the MMO industry: the curse of World of Warcraft. Or perhaps it was poor management, a lack of experience in the field, tough competition, and an even tougher industry, and Curt Schilling's ego, which led to the cancellation of Project Copernicus. Either way, it's fun to think about what could have been.